Welcome to the Shield Your Business from Chaos podcast, where there's no building, no people, no third-party suppliers, and no systems all combined to create Chaos the Dragon, which is battled by King Phoenix and his shield.
Hi, welcome to the Kingsbridge BCP podcast. I'm Roswitha Firth, and today we're going to continue our conversation with our guest, Chris Dunbar, talking about if everything I have is in the cloud, why do I still need a DR plan? Thanks for joining us again today.
So a lot of what I was discussing was in situations where you as the either BCDR practitioner or consultant is in the situation where you are at the genesis of a relationship with a vendor who's going to be hosting your applications, your data. And in that genesis situation, you have the optimal opportunity to work with the application owners as well as the vendors to negotiate a level of recoverability and transparency that matches the criticality and so forth that you've identified for that application based on any application impact, business impact, or vendor impact analyses that you may have done. Another way to look at it, though, is where most of us are when we come into an organization or we've been there for a while and it's time to do the BIA, it's time to do the risk assessment, and we find we've got all these applications that are hosted off-site. They've got multi-year agreements and they're managed by other companies. What do? I mean, if you do your analysis, you hope to get some transparency from the vendor. So you really need to work with your application owner, to work with the account manager to establish a rapport. They may be willing to fill out data collection forms or take part in interviews. But bottom line is you need to, of course, gather the information you need about what they currently do for testing, training, support, and everything else. I mean, they are essentially doing what you were doing as a company before you outsourced that to that vendor. So, I mean, that's part of the process. You're going to be limited, though, depending on what kind of response you get back. In most cases, if there is a greater level of resiliency, redundancy, transparency, some companies will have specific tiers of resiliency that each tier costs a different amount of money. So since you already have a contract in place, then is probably not the best time to renegotiate it. So that's why you would, of course, make note of your current state and share that information with your senior leadership, your application owners. But work with the app owner, find out when that particular service or application is up for renewal, and then help them build into the business case for the renewal the level of recoverability, resiliency, redundancy that is required based on the BIA and risk assessments.
Use King Phoenix and Shield with its mapping, its dashboards, its permissioning, its dependency mapping, and its automatically redacted plans to shield your business from chaos. KISSBCP.com.
Well, to your point, sorry. To your point, that's exactly one of the times that you do need a disaster recovery plan, because the contract exists. And unless all of those things are already in the contract, which there's a pretty good likelihood that they're not yet, that at least for that window before the contract's renegotiated and things might change, you need a disaster recovery plan. Because what if that SLA or any of the clauses in the contract don't provide you with the coverage that you need, the RPO that you need, the RTO that you need for a particular system? Then you absolutely need to fill that gap by having a disaster recovery plan. The challenge there, the challenge there is what happens when the business owners and IT decide that we're just going to live with it because it costs too much to have vendor redundancy. So
there are different types of plan documents that you could put together. From a technical perspective, you'd want to put together different types of contingency plans. Should you lose connectivity with that with any particular external service provider. On the information security side, this is also very important. If you to have the capability to detect whether you might be having corrupted data that's coming into your environment, and have a way to quickly halt that traffic, analyze it, and take remedial action. On the user side, so this goes with internally hosted applications as well, but the business needs to have downtime procedures that they would follow if the application or service is not available. Now, depending on the business processes that use those services, some may require striking up the manual process as quickly as possible, especially if you're talking about a hospital system or some other environment where lives are at risk or a lot of money is at risk. So it goes to the criticality of the application or service as to what level of an implementation of downtime procedures are relevant, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Did you want to? Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I didn't. I wanted to ask if you wanted to say more about negotiating with the vendor. If there was any tips or anything that you wanted to add to that part of the conversation.
Certainly. So it's important to first find out whether they even have different tiers of recoverability, resiliency, et cetera. And part of that, I guess, depends on what type of service they're delivering to you. If it's a hosted data center type of environment where you're managing the applications, but they're providing the virtual infrastructure, probably you have control over what level of resiliency you want at any time, really. And usually there's some type of a portal that you can go into to configure whether you want various types of replication schemes, whether you want storage replication in different regions. Of course, that's going to cost you. But the good thing is those costs are generally found right up front. You don't need to go to an account rep to get that type of information.
Yeah.
Now, in situations, though, where you are paying for a service, you're paying maybe the monthly usage fee, And that same service is farmed out to a lot of other companies. And in a lot of those situations, you get what you get. They don't have different levels of resiliency, redundancy.
Use King Phoenix and Shield with its mapping, its dashboards, its permissioning, its dependency mapping, and its automatically redacted plans to shield your business from chaos. KISSBCP.com.
What you want to negotiate for then is basically more transparency and more involvement. You have testing, training. You have testing and exercise as part of your normal cycle, your normal monthly cycle, quarterly, however often you do testing. Are you including these vendors in there? You may want to, and in this thread, when you go to the vendor, find out what level of testing or exercises are they willing to participate with you on.
And in what way?
Exactly. And is there a special requirement for instance, if your application uses an SFTP server on their site for day-to-day file transfer, but you want to keep test and exercise data separate from the protection data, you can work with them to have a separate testing SFTP server, and then that's what you would use with them to keep your test data separate from your production data.
That's a great point. It definitely requires a higher level of involvement from your service provider. And I think it's a challenge when, as you had mentioned earlier, when these contracts already exist, you may not have the opportunity to get that level of engagement until the contract's been renegotiated. One other point that I wanted to go back to, something that we talked about earlier in the conversation, was about the force majeure clause. Did you want to say anything specifically about that? I've read plenty of contracts, certainly, before they were signed, looking for exactly what we've been talking about as far as resiliency from vendors and transparency. But force majeure is certainly something that we all need to be aware of.
It is. I remember, and I'm not going to name names, of course, but reading through recovery services contracts. Those are always lovely. I mean, this is going back years and years and years. And the whole point of the contract is to provide services during a force majeure event, and yet there's a force majeure clause. So that always strikes me as devilishly ironic.
Yeah, there's no getting around some of that legalese. Go ahead.
Well, if I might too, going back to the subject of disaster recovery plans, do you need them in these situations with external vendors? And I would say yes, but they're going to be a little bit different. See, if you have application-based DR runbooks for your internal applications, generally speaking, you are going to use those if you're going to have to shut down integrations for the application, bring down the application gracefully, fail it over by altering the network addressing, bringing it back up, and making sure it's operational. A lot of those same things you're still going to do, although the responsibilities for carrying out those actions may not necessarily be you, they'll be the vendor. So you still would need to have that type of documentation, that type of an application to your runbook. But in the situation involving vendor-owned or vendor-hosted services, your focus really is going to be on the network changes and making sure that the traffic is stopped and brought back up. So you're still going to need that, and especially if you have runbooks, master disaster recovery runbooks that handle multiple applications in a single failover activity, then the context of redirecting traffic for that application needs to coincide with any other application failovers that you're conducting at the same time.
Right, absolutely. As for the people, I think where we left off last time, we were talking about the if the service provider, your vendor, is providing services that require people, whether it is a support line to call for managing that particular information. There isn't necessarily a backup plan that you can build for that, because you can't hire another vendor to provide people for that third party that you have a contract with. They need to be providing people to fulfill that function that they've contractually committed to. Do you have any wisdom or experience when that doesn't happen, about how things sort of fall apart or don't fall apart?
Use King Phoenix and Shield with its mapping, its dashboards, its permissioning, its dependency mapping, and its automatically redacted plans to shield your business from chaos. KISSBCP.com.
What I suggest is to look at that as more of supply chain resiliency. If we look at it that way, even if you don't have them active, you want to at least have identified other suppliers that can provide you the same supplies in case there's an interruption in the delivery of those supplies. Data
or people.
services, or people, yes. Data services should not be looked at any differently than that. And I realize, I mean, you're not going to go out and get two different HR tracking, time tracking systems or applications. Unless, of course, your company's gone through a lot of mergers, so you have 3 or 4 different systems that do the same thing. And that, that's a different story. But
Right.
You at least need to be prepared for the possibility that a vendor could have their services disrupted for months.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to name names again, of course, but everyone knows recent outages with some of these companies. And yeah, it's important to use your BIA, use your AIA and your risk assessment to help you determine where you should make those types of contingencies. Where does it make sense to do so? I mean, of course, for some applications, certainly at your level in the organization, there is just one choice. So in that scenario, then it's more of working with the business, as I mentioned earlier, to have downtime procedures and contingency plans in place. But if you are in a more fortunate type of environment, or if the requirements and everything else are just perfect, then you can request a change to find a company that is more conducive to providing the transparency, the redundancy, resiliency that your business needs.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I think we're close to the end of our time today. Thank you, Chris, for being a guest on the Kingsbridge BCP podcast. I think this has been a really interesting topic that doesn't always get enough coverage. And for those who perhaps are jumping in very late to the conversation, if everything you have is in the cloud, do you still need a disaster recovery plan? The answer is most likely
yes. And thank you, Roswitha, for having me on.
Really appreciate it. And to our audience, find us wherever you find your podcasts, Kingsbridge BCP. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks for listening and watching today. Find your business continuity podcast from Kingsbridge BCP wherever you find your podcasts. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Chris Dunbar, talking about if everything is in the cloud, do I still need a disaster recovery plan? Listen to part 1 and part 2. We hope you enjoy. Thanks.